Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Mike Burgard, Chief Information Security Officer here at Marco Technologies. Today, I've got Jon Roberts, our Cyber Operations Manager, with me as well. We wanted to take a minute and just unpack the statement issued by President Biden earlier this week and on the nation's cybersecurity and really what that means to us. And then, to be fair, there's been a lot of things that have followed in the last couple of days on top of this, really kind of building upon it when we look at statements released by CISA and the FBI and the NSA and some of the other agencies like that, and including regulatory bodies and things that might apply to you as well. It's been a busy week. Let's just sum it up with that. With that, I'd say let's jump right in. Let's not take any further time, and we're going to bounce right over to President Biden's statement here. So if we take a look at what that was, on March 21st, which would have been Monday this week, the president's office issued a statement on the nation's cybersecurity. And really what this was targeted for is all organizations and really every citizen of the United States that, hey, there's an increased risk of cyber attack given what's going on geopolitically. We look at the Ukraine-Russian conflict and a lot of the sanctions that have been put into place with that. There is a significant threat now that there could be counterattacks or really in that cyber domain coming back our way. And that's ultimately what this talks about. And if we kind of scroll down through it, there's really a couple of key things that are really in the meat of this towards the bottom. First and foremost, I'd call out that the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and that's a mouthful, we commonly call that CISA. CISA has actively been kind of the glue that holds all the threat intelligence sharing together. And really what they're doing is they're compiling all this information. They're the organization that is sharing information between federal agencies and the private sector, as well as state and local governments. So CISA has taken the lead on that. And that's we've seen very good community involvement. We participate with our local CISA office, and that's where we get a lot of the active and very current threat intelligence information, as well as updates that we use to protect our managed customers and feed into the services that we offer. But first and foremost, I would say know that, because we're going to talk about CISA here a few more times as we go through and unpack this. The second thing I would call out is that there's a link. The second link you'll see here is really on how to harden your defenses. And the key thing is, I urge our private sectors to harden their cyber defenses immediately, right? The fact that the president's using immediately in this statement to all organizations should tell you something. Based on threat intelligence that we're seeing, there is immediate threats to all organizations. And that's why this one's different. I know we've become numb in the last year or so to all these different things on cybersecurity, but this one really is different. There's been such a focus on this, including community and partner engagement with the corporate and private sectors in the United States from the federal government, because the risk right now is very, very high. So without further ado, let's jump over to that fact sheet and take a look at it. All right, again, if we start on this one, you can roll through and there's a lot of stuff that's kind of just setting the table as to why this was released and what the current theater and climate looks like, as well as what we've done to some of our partners. But if I dive back into it, you can see this kind of talks about, going back to November of last year, building into it. The United States government and CISA ultimately released a Shields Up campaign here about 2 months ago. It's pretty close to 2 months now. There's a lot of information on that. And that's, ultimately the organization that has been tasked with creating and really facilitating the information sharing between all organizations, commercial, public and private. So we're going to focus on that. We're going to dive into that. But this one went a little bit further. It talks about, hey, all organizations in the private sector still play a role in protecting critical services to which Americans rely, right? And that's because we're subcontractors in a lot of cases, or the services that we provide are to other organizations. And eventually there's some sort of connection out to national defense or the economy or patient life care and things like that. So that's important to understand. Critical services here, which sometimes under CISA would be called critical infrastructure, they get their own messages, right? They get some things unique to them. This message is not that focused. This message really does apply to everybody in both public and private sectors. And it then goes on to break it out, right? We recommend or urge companies to execute the following steps with urgency. So again, the key thing here is with urgency. Let's unpack these, right? So I want to hit these bullets up. If we take the first one, mandate the use of multi-factor authentication on your systems to make sure that it's just harder for attackers to get into the system. We've all heard the statistics on this. Microsoft has said 99.9% of all login events, malicious login events, could be prevented with multi-factor authentication. Jon, what's your take on this bullet?
Yeah, multi-factor authentication, absolutely, it is a critical control anymore to have in place. We see it, like you said, 99% of the incidents we work probably would have been avoided or at least hampered by having multi-factor authentication. So as far as where this falls on priorities, having it as the first bullet point makes sense. It's absolutely a critical piece of security to have in place.
Yeah, and I think if you look at so Microsoft, I think it was released some numbers here recently that said less than 30% of all organizations that use Office 365 still have multi-factor in place today, right? So that means 70% of those using Office 365 don't use multi-factor across the organization. That's a bad statistic, right? That's a poor thing. But Jon, if I maybe I'm not using that today, and I understand, hey, with urgency now I do need to take action. Where would you maybe put multi-factor first in the organization?
Anything accessible from the internet. So typically we say remote access into your network and anything that's a cloud app like Office 365 or a website that you'd be logging into. That's where we want to start.
Got it. I think that's great advice. Let's move on to the next one. So deploy modern security tools on your computers and devices to continually look for and mitigate threats, right? So modern security tools, well, that's an interesting statement. I've got antivirus on my tool. I use a VPN client kind of a thing. Are those not modern tools? Help me understand what I'm missing with that.
Yeah, modern security tools. This one typically boils down to endpoint detection and response is typically what we're looking for here. The next generation or the current generation of antivirus, really the tools that give you insight into what's going on your endpoints. It's no longer just okay to say, hey, I know this file's bad, let's block it. We also want to understand what the users are doing or what processes are kicking off and executing on those endpoints so we can better protect activity on that endpoint and block it if it's malicious.
Yeah, very good. That's an evolution for a lot of organizations again as well. And again, these tools exist for a reason. They're extremely effective at what they do. So thanks for that summary. Let's move on to the next one. So check with cybersecurity professionals to make sure your systems are patched, protected against vulnerabilities. Change passwords across your networks. Previously stolen credentials are useless to malicious threat actors. So kind of two different things in this one. Let's peel this one back. So patching and vulnerabilities. We heard a lot about vulnerabilities in 2021. It was kind of the first year that we had global exposure to just the real risks that they can prevent. Jon, what do you commonly see as kind of the challenges with vulnerabilities that many organizations have? And why isn't patching as easy as everybody thinks?
Yeah, patch. That's got to be an age-old question there. Patch management's been around forever, but every organization seems to struggle with it in some capacity or another, and ultimately comes down to visibility, knowing when patches are being applied or maybe failing. Right, a lot of times we might have systems that are unsupported by the vendor, so we don't even know they're not getting patches, or maybe somebody brings in the device, plugs it into your network, and you just don't have visibility that this unprotected, unpatched device is running in your network. So having a robust vulnerability management program that you're continuously scanning your network, looking at your endpoints and looking at those patch reports, making sure that those patches are actually getting applied and installed on your endpoints is very important.
Yeah, very good. Let's take the next one, right? So if I'm reading this one, I'm probably going, wait a minute, how would passwords even get stolen off my network by malicious actors? What do you got to say in response to that?
Unsurprisingly, users are your weakest link, right? You can have the most robust password policy in the world, and all it takes is a user to accidentally click on a link in a phishing email or something like that and give up their password to the bad guys. And then from there, especially if you don't have something like multi-factor authentication, which we already talked about, they can pretty much do what they want on your network.
Yeah, that's fair. And I would even add to that one, let's not forget about the dark web out there. We're all human, and I think it's pretty easy to reuse that password multiple sites. So sometimes it could be hey, I use the same password in the network as I did maybe on a social media website or something like that was compromised, and now my password's been leaked elsewhere. And then insider threat can pop into that one too. We've seen that absolutely pop up where threat actors overseas now are offering sums of money to gain credentialed access into environments as well. Think about it, paying somebody, $5,000 or even $50,000 to collect a $2 million ransom. That's pretty good ROI at that point. So definitely willing to do that. Let's move on to back up your data and ensure you have offline copies. Can you maybe just briefly talk about the point or importance of the 3-2-1 backup methodology and what we're after with that?
Yeah, really, when we say 3-2-1 backup methodology, what we're looking for is making sure that you have multiple copies of your backups and they're secured offline typically. So we often see attackers get into a network and either encrypt or delete your backups, right? They know a common response to attacks is to simply restore your systems from a valid backup. They change their target and say, hey, let's destroy these backups. So making sure these backups are either replicated to the cloud or stored on storage that can't be modified is what we're looking for when we're saying we want to make sure we're protecting our backups and having offline backups.
Yeah, thank you. And I can't stress the importance of that one right there. That's a technology that we expect to be there, and it gets very little awareness or attention until all of a sudden it's one of the most critical things you're relying on. 3-2-1 being 3 copies of backup data, 2 in 2 different sites with 1 immutable copy, or 1 copy that can't be modified by ransomware. I think, as Jon said, offline, right, or as mentions here. And so next one's my favorite one. This is one I like. It's a passion of mine, but run exercises and drill emergency plans, and y'all can read the rest of that. But Jon, what do we commonly call that? What does that mean?
Yeah, incident response testing, right? Making sure that our processes that we have in place actually work as intended. And I think it's pretty easy that many organizations, the IT department probably says, yep, we've got this in place. We test our plan every once in a while, but making sure you pull in everyone else in your organization as well, your other stakeholders from the different branches of the organization. If an IT system goes down, IT is going to have their hands full containing that, responding, remediating. What are the other branches of your business doing while that's going on? How are your employees continuing to work? How are they helping remediate for you?
Yeah, exactly. And I love tabletops. And I think one of the things that comes with this is you've got to throw some variety in there. We always assume everything works perfect in a tabletop scenario. And we know in reality that's not the case, right? Ransomware is pretty devastating, including to backups, to the point that 40% of the time-ish we're seeing backups not actually work. So we need to be able to test what happens when that's the case. I would also encourage organizations right now, make sure you're testing things like those generators and stuff too, because remember that cyber attack may not be directly on you. That cyber attack may be on critical infrastructure, such as the underlying power service. Make sure that generator can start. What happens if it's a carrier that goes down and we just lose internet connectivity? How do we continue to operate, right? Think outside the box. And, we're happy to provide some solutions upon reference. I think MITRE has a really good guide on probably 85 to 90 different things that should be tabletop because they are threats to our organization. And, think about the threat modeling that you can do. There's a lot to it. So yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that one. Let's move down to encrypt your data so it cannot be used if stolen. I think this one's relatively self-explanatory, but you want to maybe just touch on exfiltration and kind of what we see around that.
Absolutely. The trend in the last few years is that these bad guys are trying to take your data off network. So they then hold it hostage, right? And they ask you to pay the ransom. Otherwise, they're going to release this data to the public. If you're encrypting your data and protecting it against unauthorized access, the chances of that happening are smaller, right? So that's what we're trying to get at with encrypting your data wherever it's at. We typically say at rest, in motion, and in transit. So if it's on somebody's workstation, we want to make sure it's encrypted. If we're sending it to somebody else in the organization or outside of the organization, we want to make sure that's encrypted as well.
Yeah, thanks. Encryption, one of those things we're stuck with it for life, right? Let's educate our users on common tactics that threat actors use through email or various websites, and encourage them to report if their computers or phones have shown unusual behavior, such as crashes, operating slowly, even some things like that. And I think the key thing I want to touch on first on this one is unusual behavior really can mean a lot of things, right? And unfortunately, that means reporting noise goes up, right? We all know that sometimes things just don't operate very fast. We're recording on a WebEx today, for example, and sometimes WebEx isn't the fastest out there, right? It can saturate a PC pretty bad. We still want to report on those things if there's really no explanation for it, because that can be an indication that something's going on. We call that commonly an indicator of compromise, right? And we want to eliminate that right away. It's the see something, say something methodology that we take into this, but can't stress that enough. And I've heard that on a number of calls I've been on with various intelligence organizations this week, that these right now are some of the key things that we're hearing it starts with just unusual behavior. But Jon, let's. What are your thoughts on just other things that we need to educate employees on, and maybe touch on reporting too, and just how to report when something's urgent, or at least our recommendation. Obviously, we'd encourage organizations to follow their policies, but touch on your thoughts.
Yeah, making sure your employees know what to report and how to report it. Those are two important elements that might get glazed over or glossed over if you don't actually spend time thinking about it, right? Making sure that your users understand the urgency behind reporting something. They're not just sending an email and expecting, hey, I reported it to IT, my job's done. Is it urgent enough that they actually have to pick up the call and pick up the phone and call your IT department or your security department and work through the issue with them? Making sure that your users know what to look for and know how to report it. Those are the two main things that all organizations can probably improve upon or take into consideration.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. And that, again, I can't stress the importance of that enough. Proper education is where it all starts. All of these things, I shouldn't say all of them, but at least 8 out of 10 times, if not even more than that, it does start with the user. So the faster and the better our users are engaging, and to be fair, that's a two-way thing. The more we're engaging with our users to share this information, the better things are as well. And you'll see some more of that in a second. The last bullet point here, so engage proactively with the local FBI office or CISA regional office and establish those partnerships. Maybe if you can take that bullet point, just talk about what that means to most organizations from a collaboration and information sharing point, and maybe conversely to that, where maybe organizations should seek guidance and just be very clear on what their processes and plans are.
Yeah, so I'll start with the fact that this Shields Up program, which we'll be getting to in a second here, is one of the most public-facing channels of communication that the government has actually implemented in the last few years. CISA is this public interface to help communicate with you and your organization about the current threats facing you and the United States. So they all have avenues of engaging them. They do webinars. You typically have a field office person you can work with and communicate with. But there's also a lot of different community channels you can work within. Marco is a great place to start for many of maybe smaller organizations. We are part of all these communities. You can work with us as well as just another resource in your tool belt, really, to get this information to you, understand what threats are out there and what you can do about them. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I just, the last thing I would add to that is everybody should also pay attention to the fact that recent legislation signed into federal law is the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act that was signed in on March 15th. It was signed by President Biden. And really, there's two key elements to that. The first one is that critical infrastructure has an obligation to report to CISA within 72 hours of an incident. Right. So, and the act goes on to define that. We're not diving into that today, but I think that's well timed for this one. And we probably should dive into that at a future date. The second thing that act calls out is that if a ransom payment's made, that must be reported within 24 hours also to CISA. They're doing this not to, the intent here isn't to punish organizations. The intent here, again, is information sharing, right? We want to make sure that other organizations out in the United States don't get hit by the same threat actor the next day or the next hour, or even the next minute, if we can get that good. That's really the purpose of what CISA's goal here is that information sharing to really protect critical infrastructure in the United States and all of us through the information they learn in critical infrastructure support. So thanks for unpacking that with. I'm going to just briefly gloss over this next one. We will share these links out here, but the next part dives into cybersecurity for technology and software companies. So if you fall into this boat, keep reading the article because it goes into things that you can do. Really, the biggest thing is start with security from the ground up, right? Make sure that security is part of software development. Why I wanted to briefly hit this one, though, is all of us consume software products. Let's make sure that we're doing our due diligence to purchase products that have security designed from the ground up, that do operate securely. And frankly, let's put the pressure on the companies out there that aren't working very well today, that aren't secure inherently, and let's make the world a better place. And that all starts with everybody's got to take their part and rise just a little bit. So we can do some things to help that one out. But again, if software applies to you, you can take and go further down this one. We did want to call that out. Let's pivot over to Shields Up real quick, though. So, and we'll end on this note. But so CISA's Shields Up program, it's a pretty simple website, www.cisa.gov/shields-up. If we pair this one out, guidance for all organizations, and this lands on a couple of things. I should start just a little bit faster, though. So if you need to know who to report to, here you go. It's right here. It's right on this Shields Up page. You can report via email or phone number. That's going to be the quickest way to get in queue. The second is latest updates. Do note that they do update this as information changes. And that was a call I was on with CISA earlier this week. They talked about that. In some cases, it's multiple times per day that this can be updated. So it's a great website to come back to. Specifically, the known exploited vulnerability catalog. That's a great way to prioritize vulnerability management in your organization, is focusing on vulnerabilities that we know are actively being exploited. That one is updating a lot faster than others. Going back to that software development and new security, you might see some trends that some vendors pop up in that list a little bit more frequently than others. Second guidance I would go to is, guidance for all organizations. Again, there's going to be some duplicity here between the president's fact sheet and what's in this. We're not going to read through every piece on this, but let's talk about just the key highlights here. So reduce the likelihood of cyber intrusion damage, right? That's really what we're after. Again, implement those fact sheet items that we just talked through. Those are going to be the most immediate things you can do to prepare your organization. The one bullet that wasn't called out, I don't think maybe as well as it should have been previously, is the know who to call if something does happen. So in that testing that I talked about, make sure you test that, hey, if something does happen, who are we going to engage with? Maybe you engage with Marco. Maybe you engage with one of the large organizations you've heard about, such as CrowdStrike or Mandiant, or some of the other large ones in the space. But know who you're going to call. I can't stress that one enough. Right now is the time to make sure that you've got the things in place to be able to quickly engage should something happen and we need to go down that path. That's where we're at. Take steps to quickly detect a potential intrusion, right? So the faster we can detect, the faster we can start response and recovery and really minimize or contain damage. Jon, how important do you see this in your day-to-day job running SOC operations?
Of course, I'm going to say extremely important. Insight is everything when it comes to these incidents. Being able to quickly detect what's going on so you can quickly respond, right? The sooner I know that somebody clicks on a link or malware executes, or maybe somebody's trying to get into my network, the quicker we can do something about it and limit potentially more harmful or more damaging results.
Exactly. And I think detecting intrusions again. So, when we kind of look at this, even just knowing where your risk hotspots are right now, if you're an organization that doesn't work with certain parts of the globe, maybe you don't work with Asian or European organizations, and on my Microsoft 365 tenant, I might want to just block logins from those locations. On my firewalls, I might want to geo-restrict them so that we just don't allow traffic from those locations. Those are some very basic things to do. They're very quick to set up, and they can very quickly eliminate a lot of risk to your organization. They can also reduce just the noise that's generated to your organization, which means picking up an actual threat becomes much more likely. All right, moving along. Let's ensure that the organization is prepared to respond if an intrusion occurs. We already talked about that, right? So again, have a plan and test it. If you don't, talk to us. We'll give you an incident response template that you would need to complete filling out for your organization. But we want to make sure you've got the tools. The key thing on this one is, though, it goes beyond just having a piece of paper. You actually have to test it. Last thing I would joke on this one is, we are a printer company. We do sell printers. Make sure that you've got a printed copy of said plans too, because unfortunately, all too often, we'll run into organizations that have not printed a plan, and their current plan is residing on a system that has malware or ransomware on it, and they're now not able to get to it. So having a hard copy of those plans, I think, is equally as important. Contact lists, all those things should be things that are rolled up into it. Jon, anything you add to kind of preparation and testing?
No, I think you covered it between that and the previous fact sheet. I think good coverage there.
Okay, maybe you could just chime in real quick. What are the top 2 or 3 cyber threats that you think people should be testing or considering in preparation of this plan?
Yeah, so business email compromise is what we see most frequently. So understanding how you're going to respond if somebody's account does get compromised, somebody gives up credentials, and now a potentially bad actor has access to your network. So that would be one of the main things I test. It typically is a little bit more involved than people realize, right? If somebody gets access to email accounts, they have access to all the information in that email account as well. And there's typically some privacy considerations you have to take into account. Ransomware is obviously a pretty hot topic because it's so damaging to the organization. So that's another one that gets practiced quite frequently. Understanding how that impacts your systems and how you might be able to recover from a ransomware attack.
Got it. Thanks for that. And the last one, it's going to seem like I'm skipping over this, but I'm doing so because we've talked about it a lot. Maximize the organization's resilience to destructive cyber incidents. So really this one's backup. We talked about backup in the fact sheet, and the fact sheet's really designed to minimize damage or destructive things from this. And I think this one's important because if we look historically at some of the things that have come out of kind of the Russian Federation, it's, things like NotPetya and some of those, right? They've been very poorly written, if you will. They're destructive. They'll go fast and loose, and they wipe out a bunch of stuff, sometimes more than people would expect. And the level of destruction is definitely higher than some of the more select things that we've seen, like Lockbit and some of those. So please be aware of that. I think that's important to realize is that, hey, the threats here are very real. The destruction capability is pretty high just historically, which does feed partially into that intelligence as well. There's also some really good information down below. If you look at the link, stopransomware.gov is a great resource page to go to. Again, we've got a cybersecurity checklist published out on our site. It's like 30 some steps broken down. So it's very easy to follow. You can just read through, check the pictures kind of a thing, know where you assess and get a plan moving forward. Start just by knocking one or two things off, right? Start now, start on something, pick it and go. Recommendations for corporate leaders. So I'll take this as an executive of the organization. Right now, the time is for communication to be occurring, right? We should be talking to our leadership. We should be having the conversations about, hey, what is our current threat profile? Where are we at from a risk standpoint? And what are we going to do about it? Are we prepared? What are some of the things we're doing to stay current around this? Share information. It doesn't take a lot of guesswork to figure out that most CEOs are right now, this risk is pretty high on their list. If your chief executive officer is not asking questions, odds are good they're thinking about it. It's a good time to engage and start sharing what's going on. You'll focus on continuity, testing of plans. Again, the things we've already talked about. Lower reporting thresholds. Again, going back to that maybe unusual system behavior, something we don't normally care as much about. We do want to care about right now. And then planning for the worst. We just talked about that. The level of destruction on this could be pretty high. Ransomware response. There's some really good things listed here. Again, stopransomware.gov. Not going to dive into this one specifically. We've covered this in cyber resiliency workshops and things before, and we're happy to have conversations on that. There's a couple of good checklists. I'd say take the federal checklists that have been prepared and provided, put our checklists on top, or follow a framework. Ultimately, that's what we're going to guide you to, by the way, is follow a framework like CIS controls or NIST cybersecurity framework. There's reasons to use different ones there, ultimately both. But you want to do that. And then I'm just going to kind of summarize or end this one on this last bullet of steps you can do to protect yourself and your family. This one's important. Again, we talked about it all comes down to people. Many organizations, including the Verizon Data Breach Report and other common global reports, have all reported that well over 8 out of 10 attacks happen because of people, right? It all starts with people. If you're listening to this, odds are good you're seen by somebody in your social circles as more of a technology expert than the person listening to you or asking the questions, right? Be a resource, at least understand what's in these. And really, there's a couple of key things that we want everybody to share. Implementing multi-factor authentication really is a key thing. Things like Face ID and fingerprint Touch ID or fingerprint recognition, those are good things, right? Even text messaging on social media sites and some of those things, that still is a multi-factor authentication layer that's better than nothing. Is it the best option? It's not. Frankly, it's not, and there's reasons for that. But something is better than nothing right now. Anywhere you've got an account you can turn multi-factor authentication on, you should do so. The second thing, update your software. Even at home, our home computers need updates too, whether it's Windows, Mac, as in my case, or whatever that case may be. please update those operating systems, update your software endpoint protection products. Let's make sure we're updating our web browsers being one of the most impactful, by the way. But let's update those products as we continue to use our home systems. And again, let's encourage our social circles to be doing the same thing. Don't forget your smartphones, by the way. iOS and Android updates are pretty important too. Most of those do contain security updates. Thinking before you click, again, it all starts with phishing. It really does. And they list here over 90% start with phishing. I got to believe that number. That's based on what's been reported to CISA and the FBI. But I got to believe it because we see it. We see it every single day. And it only takes one user in an organization to cause these things to happen, unfortunately. That's what it comes down to. But think before you click. And again, if you see something, say something. If you do click, the faster they can report. Let's not be bashful, right? Let's get it reported and let's move on. And then just ending with strong passwords. You might think, if I've got multi-factor, why do I need strong passwords? Well, because multi-factor actually can be bypassed in that 0.1% of the time. And depending on how some of these software applications are written, vulnerabilities and things can be exploited. That does actually increase that potential a little bit in some cases as well. So strong passwords still are important. Jon, what would you say is kind of the minimum for a strong password today? Maybe how would you handle the fact that in our personal lives and protecting our family, it's not uncommon for us to have 80 to 100 passwords?
Yeah, the minimum for a strong password, it's going to vary depending on the source you look at. 14 is quite often thrown out there, depending on again, the source you're looking at. But really what a good practice is, or a practice people should be implementing it, is having a password manager. Having a central place for all of your passwords, so you can have extremely long, unique passwords for every single one of your applications. And then you have one strong password that protects that password manager. That way, your passwords are long, complex, easy to change, and easy to access, yet still secured for you and anyone else in your family or circle of friends.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. Couldn't have said it any better than that. I think that summarizes it very well. Again, LastPass, Dashlane, 1Password. There's some really good options out there. Again, those are personal things. We'd encourage you just to go take a look and use those. And don't forget that those solutions can apply inside your organization as well, because we want to encourage our employees to do good password hygiene practices and follow the right things. So, Jon, we covered a lot here. I think that does take us to the end of the guide. There's some additional resources at the bottom we're not going to cover with that. But anything you'd like to add in summary?
Yeah, I think what I'll end with is we just went through a lot of information, right? And we often hear, hey, that's really overwhelming. Where do I start? And the answer there is start somewhere. Take an item or two off these bullet point lists. Multi-factor authentication is a great one. Focus on that and get it done, right? Move that needle. It's pretty daunting looking at this whole list and knowing where to start. So pick one or two, go after it, get it done, move on to the next one. If you're still unclear where to start, obviously you can engage people like Marco. We can help do security assessments and help understand your environment a little better and figure out where to start. So that would be my closing remark. Start somewhere. Let's move that needle. Let's get something done and then move on to the next.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. We're all on a security journey and we're all going to be in different places. I think the key thing right now is that we're on the road and we're moving. A stationary target's the easy target to hit. So with that, thanks everybody for taking the time. Hopefully you found this useful. A lot of good information here in the Shields Up website, and we'll provide links to Shields Up as well as the statement from President Biden. We look forward to having further discussions, and do what you can to stay safe. Thank you. Have a good day.